I said at this point, this is more about practice like you play. And
Right.
since we don't know what the hell we're doing yet, good to have some raw material to play with.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So, not to put you on the spot, but do you have a place you'd like to start, like in terms of your story, what you're most focused on now? Anywhere
Yeah,
that you want,
yeah,
really?
we could talk about that. I think starting how I ended up where I am now. Well, I'll go all the way back as far as about 1989.
Okay, that's a good jaunt.
1989. Um, that would have made me hell. 1989. That would have made me 21. Actually, it's about when I started working in the health food area, and I was working for a little health food store called Green Earth in Evanston, Illinois, right outside of Chicago, and it was one of my first like official like jobs where I had like a schedule and a clock to clock in on and all of that. But it was my first introduction to anything health food, natural food related. And really, what it introduced me to even more was the culture that came with that sector. The types of people. Mostly. I mean, it was diverse, I guess, in at that time, and what you can call like really diverse in terms of people's relationship to sexual identity, politics, being familiar with different types of food. Food is a good place to start in developing diversity because nobody wants the same thing all the time. So, in that industry, it was mostly natural and organic focused, really strict around, at that point, you couldn't find sugar like anywhere in any ingredients because people didn't want it.
Right, right.
That's changed quite a bit. But it was sort of my beginning into this journey. And I worked there probably about 8 or 9 months, and then I ended up um, moving to Washington D.C. to attend Howard University,
And you
and
studied
I studied
communications
I
there, right?
studied studied communications, journalism. Ended up getting more into radio, but print journalism was where I started
Okay.
initially. And as I was attending Howard, um, I needed a job, so I found a job at another health food store in D.C. And I got a job working in the produce department, and I worked with this woman named Dina Davis. And Dina Davis was the manager of the produce department, but she also ran her own farm.
Nice.
So she was just like very meticulous about produce in general. Had a passion about it. Taught me a lot and how to care for, especially things going up on the retail floor. And but having some empathy around what it took to produce it. She really put that into me. Like this isn't just from the time it lands here, we are still taking care of it until whoever it is buys it off the shelf. So a lot of her protocols, practices, I consider best practices things I still do today.
Right. That's good.
But that was kind of what it was. I was working, going to school, working, going to school. Sometimes I wasn't going to school and just working. But I was never just going to school and not working. So I worked at that store. That first store was called Hugo's Market, up near Chevy Chase in the D.C. area. And then I ended up finding another store that was a little bit closer to me, called Naturally Yours. It was over in DuPont Circle, and I could walk to work instead of having to catch a bus and a train. And at that store, I was a cashier. I mean, it was a smaller store, and everybody pretty much did everything.
Right.
And once again, you just becoming more familiar with that sector, and more familiar with different types of people. And it was there that somebody introduced me to the idea of food co-ops, which I never even knew anything about. but one of the employees there said, I think you'd really like to work at a co-op. And
what was that employee picking up on, do you think, in retrospect? Like, were you talking about interests that you had, societal issues that you were recognizing at the time?
I think it had a lot to do with the politics, a lot to do with, social justice and just overall. I think sometimes it came up like, where do I go from here? Where is this? I'm working in the store. It's privately owned. Where's the ceiling?
Right. Right.
And what she had learned about co-ops is that, well, it's more of an egalitarian atmosphere where there's more likelihood that you'll receive equal pay and treatment in that environment than you would working in any private owned store.
So your initial interest in that model was primarily through the lens of like, okay, I'm an employee. My situation is going to change for the
Right.
better if I'm involved in a co-op versus a private industry.
Correct.
Cool.
Correct.
Cool. And what year would this have been in?
That was probably about 91.
Okay,
About
so 2 years later,
1991.
and where were you in your studies with that? Were you like in the middle?
I was actually just in my second semester.
Okay.
Because I was paying for school.
Yeah.
And it was just like, all right, I'm going to stretch this out,
Yeah.
and so that's where that went.
And you were focused on journalism and communications.
Correct.
Did that? And I know, I mean, from my own experience, I don't know if your experience directly parallels that, but in my second year of studies in my discipline, I still really didn't know much about my chosen field.
Right.
I was just trying to get
Right.
used to the process of being in a university and stuff, and
Right.
how all that worked. But was that did that aspect? I could see where being focused on journalism and looking at life through that lens could directly bear on the issues of social justice that you were recognizing.
I think that and just other things that were happening at the time. If you just think about there was a sort of a resurgence of political awareness through the music, through the culture, Public Enemy, Tribe Called Quest, Brand, like all of those influences, all of that stuff was happening at the same time.
And that was also in your field.
Correct.
I mean, that was
Right.
that's another thing, a thread I don't want to lose in this is
Right.
and that's why I'm interested in your timeline, like and not to get off track from what the point you're trying to make, but at what point did you really start to think of yourself as a musician that had something to say about all this? Like, was it far?
Oh, that was even previous.
Yeah,
to,
I would imagine
to
it was. Yeah.
School. Yeah, it probably started with me in high school.
Okay.
As far as that goes, and also trying to. I mean, it wasn't always that way. In hip hop, it was like more about me.
Right.
Here I am. I'm super bad. I got all this stuff. I'm amazing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of embellishment.
As needed.
But, I like to think of it as speaking it into existence,
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so all of those influences also shaped the way I was thinking about labor and work and myself in that space, what that meant and what impact ultimately I was going to be able to have or what change I was going to be able to affect in the work that I was doing. So it all seemed to tie in, this whole idea of co-op. So the person who told me about the co-op eventually got a job at a co-op, and but we kept in touch. And probably a year or so later, she reached out to me and she said, "Hey, I'm moving, I'm leaving, and they're going to probably be looking for somebody to replace me. So you
Nice.
should come up and apply." So I did. I went out to Bethesda, and particularly Cabin John, Maryland, which is an interesting little place, and applied for the co-op position there, which was another produce position. And so I was hired because the produce manager really wanted somebody who had experience. And because of my previous experience with Dina, I knew how to run a produce department. So I was hired there. And Man, that was about 91, 92. And I worked there in the produce section. I eventually became the produce manager because that person left, and did that for a while. Had people that I was supervising, and eventually that place ended up needing to hire a general manager, and I applied and became the general manager in that store. And that was my first opportunity to be a general manager of a co-op.
And you were about 24 at the time, something like that?
I was probably 25, 26.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, no, I was older than that. Because I remember having this idea. my like financial success bar was based on something that I heard. It's like, well, you should be able to make, your salary should be about what your age is.
Where did they come up with?
And I don't know why, but that stuck with me.
You, yeah.
I felt like, all right, I got to negotiate. And I remember negotiating for at least a salary of $30,000. So I might have been close to 30 by that time.
So by then you graduated.
So so that's another story within the story.
Okay.
Is while I was attending Howard, I was trying to get into their radio department, and that was one of the most sought after like internship positions there.
I see.
And it was like a line around the block, literally.
Wow.
The waiting list. But someone who I also met at the health food store, one of my coworkers, happened to work at the radio station at the University of the District of Columbia.
Okay.
And they had a full-on 50,000-watt transmitter radio station. They ran a jazz format with a lot of talk. And she said, well, why don't you come in one night and sit with me, and I'll show you, how the boards are, how to run the boards, and how it all works. And she had a midnight to 6 shift. So I think she was mostly looking for company.
Right.
But so I went in and sat there and got to be familiar with their board and how they did things, and she told me I was welcome to come anytime I want. So I made it a point, every time that I could to show up. And eventually she just started to show me how, everything worked. There's a lot of downtime in the midnight to 6, especially in the jazz format, where you might find a 15-minute song.
Right.
So you put on the song, and then she showed me what the production room looked like, how to make like slots for commercials and ads and things like that. So as she's teaching me all of this stuff, I'm taking it in, and I'm like, wow, I don't know how I can apply it. I'm in my mind, I'm like, how can I apply this toward credit for school?
Right.
And it wasn't going to work because it was 2 different schools. Howard didn't want me. They didn't want me doing anything like that and trying to apply it to their academics. So it had to go through their channel. But she eventually convinced the station manager to let me do sit-ins for her. So I would actually sit in on her show when she needed to take, a night off. And so I'd be doing the whole thing here in this full-on radio station, midnight to 6. And it was, some risk, but, midnight to 6 if you do something.
Right. Not the highest
Not a
stakes.
whole bunch of people are going to notice. And that led to me doing her show pretty regularly. And then eventually that station asked me if I wanted to engineer for the afternoon talk show. And so they had a talk show that was, I think it was from 11 to 1 or something like that. Maybe noon to 2. I can't remember the time. And as I'm doing that, they went on and helped me to apply for my FCC license. So I got my FCC license through UDC, which I didn't even attend, which I always was like, is this cool? Like, am I taking somebody else's opportunity? And they said, no, actually, there aren't a lot of people applying, and the one other person that did is already on with us, so, this is fine.
So Howard was overrun with applicants, and this
Correct.
other university had a dearth? And
yeah. So it was a city college.
Okay.
So it wasn't, whatever it was in terms of everything else, it wasn't as prestigious.
Gotcha.
But in terms of their radio station, they had a 50,000-watt transmitter.
Yeah.
So they were a legit station, that ran jazz all day. So, I was going to get more experience there probably than I would have ever gotten at Howard, because the Howard station that I was applying for was simply the campus station. Like Howard had a regular radio station, but you hit the jackpot if you somehow ended up in any way associated with that station because it was big, you know. So after that is where for me things kind of made a turn. One other thing happened.
Okay.
When I was at Howard, I got to meet a syndicated journalist named William Raspberry, whose column I read every time that I could. His op-ed page was really popular. I thought he had a unique perspective. And when he came and spoke to our class, you know, my question to him was, okay, I mean, he worked for the Washington Post. I said, okay, so when I'm done with school, how do I get a job at the Washington Post? And he said, well, here's the deal. When you graduate with your degree in journalism, you're going to go and apply for a job at the Washington Post, and you're going to start in the mailroom, which is where everybody's going to start. Because if you can do this, you can already do it. But there's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
You know, and you just got to work your way up. And so he said to me, I'm not discouraging you from going to school, but if you really want to work for the paper, you need to go down there and get a job at the paper. And that really kind of opened my eyes. And I said, okay, so what am I doing now? You know, and what I started thinking was, I'm already working at the radio station. Why don't I just pivot? Why don't I want to do radio? And so eventually, that was the decision that I made. It's like, well, all right. I work part-time at the radio station. I work part-time at the co-op. I don't have a whole bunch more time for school. And if all my degree is going to net me is pretty much what I already have, maybe I can put school on hold. And that was my decision, along with the fact that I'd fallen in love and decided to try to start a young family. So it became more about the money. Like, where am I going to be able to make money and do what I want to do in this time? And so, school got put on hold. I never did actually graduate with a degree from Howard University. And I always try to make sure people understand. Like, I didn't get a degree in journalism, but this is what I studied.
How long were you there?
I was there I probably did 2.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah. I could, theoretically, I could go back and finish and get my degree, but at this point, most of what I would learn, I've already done, you know.
And you never attended the other college, though?
I never attended UDC.
What was that college called?
UDC, the University of the District of Columbia.
Got it. And so you never actually attended classes?
Never attended.
But you got a lot more out of that.
I got more out of that, and that was one of those life lessons. I was like, well, sometimes it just comes down to who you know, and being in the place at the time where you need to be there. And so, that looked great. I had a nice career track set, and I saw my sights were set on that. Like, okay, I want to be on the other side of this glass. I want to have my own talk show. I want to be doing this stuff. And that all seemed like it was a real possibility for me, But my real money maker was always at these grocery stores. You know, as I'd worked my way up to management, it's like, well, I make about what I would be making, in that position. Maybe I'd probably make a little bit more if I became really popular in radio. But something else happened outside of my control that changed my fate, and that was the fact that as the university was starting to struggle, they were looking to figure out other ways to bring in money. And the radio station was a listener-supported station, so they depended a lot on, donations and funding from listeners. And along came C-SPAN, who needed a transmitter to transmit their TV. And so they put an offer on the table to buy the transmitter / radio station. They never, I think, even set foot in the radio station because it was the transmitter that they really wanted. So eventually UDC sold their station and call number to C-SPAN. And C-SPAN, I think, still operates that space to this day. And so there, I looked at that as like, wow, man, that's okay. So here's this thing you thought was pretty solid, and it just kind of like disappeared right in front of you.
Yeah,
And
another life lesson,
had
right?
nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
So I dug deep into the co-op world.
Okay.
I said, this is what I'm going to do, man. I've been doing this. I'm a general manager. There's a trajectory that I see where I can continue to move on. And eventually I left that co-op and went and worked for another privately owned shop, but that person was interested in actually selling. So my idea was, okay, I'll take this over. This is it.
Before we move on to that, I just wanted to get a little clearer idea about what you, when you thought about doing the radio thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want to know what your aspiration was. Like, not just to be famous, not just to make a living to support your family, but was there a body of information that you felt uniquely qualified to discuss or to call
Right.
attention to? Like, what was that?
Well, I always saw those slots, those talk show slots, especially as opportunities for social commentary.
Okay.
So, it was journalism at that level where you're talking about current events every day and things that affect real people and potentially, can affect some change, using that vehicle. And that's what I saw myself doing, and then I guess I've always been wired for that. Like, how can I make things better?
Mm-hmm.
Am I a change agent? Can I do that
Mm-hmm.
in my space? And so, that was sort of what I saw as the trajectory. Is like, yeah, I'll get behind the mic. I'm comfortable with that.
And not about, for instance, some people would go into that for the purpose of calling attention to a certain type of music or something like that.
Right.
Or, but
Right.
your bent was and probably remains calling attention to these larger systemic issues.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not surprised by that answer. So, unless you want to go on about that,
No. So then, that was that one job that I took, hoping to take over that store, and that was the plan.
Right.
The owner and I talked about it. She had it since the early '70s and was looking to retire. And and for her, like that was how she was going to be able to retire. She was going to cash out, and somebody else was going to take over. And then we'll see what happens. So I worked. I must have worked there about five years.
mm-hmm.
And she was great. I mean, I learned a lot from her. I learned a lot about the business from her. She was really one of my mentors in that industry. And then, right around the time when we were starting to put some like ideas together about how to transition and what would look right, what would make sense, this operation called Whole Foods showed up.
Oh, game changer.
Yeah. And before that, we had to deal with Trader Joe's, which, but they were far enough away. And we had a, more traditional kind of natural food store platform where we had herbs, we had everything in that store. And Trader Joe's tends to operate more out on the fringes where they might have some natural and organic, but it's more sort of a gourmet shop, kind of a fun experience that people have. Whereas this was more of a go-to. In fact, they used to refer a lot of their customers to us for supplements and information and knowledge. But Whole Foods was a different thing altogether, and they were only going to be a block and a half away. And so right around that time, we just started scratching our head, and I think we had something like 18 months to figure it out. Like, how are we going to deal with them? We were strategizing, and right around then, sometime in late 2005, I started receiving calls from this guy who was a headhunter looking for a potential manager for a co-op in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which I had never heard of.
Of any of it.
And the first couple times that he called, I was like, "Who is this guy? What is he talking? Is this a joke? Like, what are you talking about?" And he was really persistent, and he says to me, "Well, you've never even heard of it. If nothing else, it's a free trip. You get to see New Mexico. They'll put you up, have your interview. If you don't like it, if they don't like you, whatever, you had your interview and they paid for it." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds like a good deal." So I came out, did the interview, and I knew, I was like, I got this job if I want it. And for a couple reasons. I was like,
You had the experience for one thing.
I had the experience, and it's one of those destinations that a lot of people, unless they were intending to come here initially, it's not necessarily a career step up coming from somewhere else,
Gotcha.
especially in that sector. And so it was like, all right, you're going to come out here and run the store. But even then, I felt a deeper connection to something, and I couldn't put a finger on it necessarily, but I felt like it was like there was some energy that I connected to here that was different than I'd ever experienced. And the first time I saw the mountains, I was like, I got to get there.
Right?
I got to get over there, And so I went through the interview and I felt pretty confident. I wasn't 100% because I just didn't know for sure who they were interviewing and, who my competition was. But I got a good feeling from the people in the store as well. And a lot of employees like, yeah, I hope they really hire you, man. Like,
Oh, that's
you
cool.
seem like you fit in here. And so when I got back, I talked to the woman I was working with and I said, listen, I have this opportunity. Here's what's going on. And she said, take it. And I said, what? She's like, take it.
That's
I
awesome.
don't have any idea what's going to happen with this business.
That's awesome.
If you took over, you'd probably struggle. And we talked about ways that we could compete, but all of them seemed like uphill.
Yeah.
And another investment, that I don't think she was comfortable making at that point. So it really worked out great because she ended up at that time also receiving an offer to buy the property, not the business, but the property. And she, bought that back in 1971. And by 2006, the property value in Alexandria, Virginia, I mean, let's just say she was able to retire.
Nice.
By selling that. And I came to New Mexico, man. And so I've been here since then. I managed the co-op from 2006 until 2015. And somewhere in there, I got the bug about farming and how that could change things and, in terms of sustainability, but also, some sovereignty and independence, how people should be able to have some control over the kind of, over what they have to eat. So I launched into that. I mean, the co-op launched into it. Actually, it wasn't just me. And we looked around and said, we had a problem. Like, we're too dependent on imports, in our industry. And if we don't help to try to establish some level of food security locally, we're going to all be in big trouble, So, the co-op and the board, we all decided we needed to take over an existing farm. Some people were running a little, they were leasing some land and doing an organic operation. And they had planned to leave. It was their last year. So we kind of stepped in and took over that farm, made it a co-op project. We ran that for about 3 years. And at the end of that project, it was like, all right, so now 3 years is up. We don't necessarily want to become permanent farmers. What are we doing? And in my mind, I was like, we can't stop.
Right.
We
you
can't
saw
stop.
the necessity for it.
And And I said, I'm gonna continue this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna keep doing this. And so that's kind of what happened. My contract was coming up at the co-op. We were trying to figure out what it looked like for me to renew. Things were definitely changing there as well. Competition was coming in. My ideas about how we could, continue to grow and expand were probably different than some people. What I was pushing was this novel idea of doing grocery delivery and having inventory on a website where people could order. And that way we'd meet this broader market. In this market, it's not as congested as in other places. And so a lot of your market is outside of your immediate locality. You got to really reach out. And one thing that we were able to gather over the years is like, man, we have members and customers all over the place, whether it's El Paso, Alamogordo, Truth of Consequences, Deming, like people who would shop at the co-op making that trip. But I'm thinking, that's them driving. What if they had this stuff available every day? Then they'd probably be regular shoppers here. And so at that time, and it just seemed like a real crazy idea to people. Like the idea that people were going to do their shopping online, grocery shopping online.
And this was by 2015. This was at the end of the.
Yeah, this was by 2000.
So the internet. The reason I bring that up is that a lot of. I'm about the same age as you are.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you're about 2 years older than I am, and so I remember a lot of the early stuff that you were talking about. That was pre-internet,
right?
At least pre-ubiquitous.
Exactly.
Internet. So, a lot of those options would have been completely alien,
correct,
to people at that time. But by 2015, people were on board and like, okay, well, this can work,
right?
So
Amazon was a thing,
right? Yeah, a big thing.
Which is, to me, I was like, it's working. Like somebody's already doing this, and there's some success there. We need to figure out how to do this, So but people are people, man, and especially one thing about a co-op is you're dealing with a board of directors of people from the community, and often what they see as the vision has to do with what they do already, or what they'd like to see themselves doing,
right?
And they didn't see themselves on a computer ordering anything, and I felt like, we're gonna have to do something, man, because competition's coming. And it's encroaching on this local market. And if we don't figure out a way to reach out to these other markets, we're going to be in trouble. So, we made a decision. By we, I mean they.
Right.
That they needed to go in a different direction for leadership, which fit right into my idea of getting more into the ag stuff. Growing more food, figuring out how to become more of a change agent. Along those lines. And so in 2006 is when I was literally like on my own. I'm doing the farm thing, 2016.
Oh, okay. Got it. So, and at that point, did you take over the exact land?
So I took over the exact same land.
Nice.
And stayed there for a couple years, and then I moved on to another place that was a little bit bigger and had some better access. That land was in Mesilla, and it was just expensive. Like, for doing what I was doing.
Right.
It's unless you're, growing some real specialty crop, or you're bringing in a whole bunch of sort of touristy, attraction, it's hard to make what you need to make to continue to pay what I was paying for rent at that time.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting, and it probably doesn't occur to most people that are not directly involved in that field. It certainly didn't occur to me, even though I was tangentially involved with a lot of people that were interested in that endeavor. But it seems like there's a big, I don't know if you'd want to call it a tradition, but like it seems like the business structure typically goes toward leasing land on the part of the people actually, that are doing the farming. Is that the norm? I'm still trying to wrap my brain around why that would be and what the benefits might be, and
there's people who do both. For me, starting with no land, it was the easiest way to get into it.
Because there was an existing lease.
Yeah, there was an existing lease. And then I found there's people willing to lease. There's people always willing to lease their land for ag.
Right.
And that made more sense to me, especially at that point, because I wasn't really sure where I was going with it, and to get locked into any kind of land mortgage without being clear on where you're going. And also I knew I needed to learn a lot, and so my biggest fear was, okay, you could buy a little bit of land and that would not be enough for you to do what you need to do.
Yeah, and if you weren't careful, you might be locked into the footprint.
Exactly, and if that's where all your resources are, then you have to figure out how to make that work. So I allowed myself, the opportunity to kind of move around and see what different things actually work for me. And that still works for me,
You mentioned, and obviously if there's something you want to expand upon, I mean, we're just getting this started, and we're going to have a lot of time to unpack various parts of this. But one of the things that I remember you recently telling me was the influence that Will Allen had on you.
Oh yeah.
What was the time frame? And forgive me if I keep coming back to the timeline, but it just helps me
no. I
understand
think that was around 2013 or 2014.
So how did that? That sounds like it was like a sledgehammer on a bowl of Jello for you.
Yeah, absolutely. My partner's from Wisconsin, and we just went to visit her family in Milwaukee. And while we were there, I had heard about Growing Power and Will Allen and what he was doing. I was like, let's see if we can go over there and get a tour. And the day that we went, I think we had just missed him, but they were still doing tours. But they were down to like their last slots, or they had already had, the slots had been filled.
Wow.
But somebody didn't show up, which allowed us to do it. So I got to do a tour of their project. I was blown away by aquaponics, the model that they were using, how much food they could get out of the space that they were in, and all of the different, and they had goats and chickens and everything in that space. And I don't think they had more than an acre.
Yeah, we need to have multiple of these, whatever they turn into, episodes where you unpack that. I really am super curious about how that all worked.
Yeah. I mean, that was just, I being somebody who had some experience growing up with, a little bit of plumbing, a little bit of construction. I could see what I could do, and I could, and I said, well, I could do that. It's simple enough.
Right.
I could figure that out. And so, when I got back, I think the following weekend, we started working on an aquaponics greenhouse out at the farm.
Right.
And I think I had it up in about a month.
Nice.
And was running, aquaponics out of there. And we had there was a learning curve there, some things I learned. But, successful enough to watch some food grow and to feel like that is something that I always want to integrate, into any project that I'm working on. I have one right now at my house.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
See, that's one of the other things I think is super interesting about the time frame in the last decade or so. The explosion of not only interest, but also like dusting off of old, even indigenous wisdom about how to grow things in various climates and things like that. Obviously, aquaponics is on the other end of that spectrum.
Right.
It's a new technology that is a combination of some old ideas. And I think it's brilliant, and I think most people intuitively grasp the poetry of it.
Yeah.
But it's but like many things, there's been a bit of a overselling of what it can do,
right,
and how fragile it or robust different systems and different approaches might be.
Right.
And so I feel like, and I even think, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but the popularization of the concept of aquaponics in the form of these little, like, okay, here's this one goldfish in a bowl with a chia thing on top.
Right.
Feels to me legitimately like disinfo. It almost seems like it's because it's so designed to fail. That to like squash any organic interest in that as something that somebody could empower themselves or their community with by understanding the real possibilities and limitations.
Yeah. I mean, it could be that, and it could just be people's intentions trying to get in as many people as possible.
Right.
I mean, a lot of times, even with what I do, people are always trying to figure out how to create, like a classroom model.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I
think that there are innocent
Yeah.
and there are nefarious reasons for.
I would imagine.
For doing all that. My read on it, although as I said, I feel like sometimes there are forces at work in society that are like, well, we can't have that. We need to like make a cautionary tale to prevent people from getting too interested in that.
Right.
I think most of the time after I process that thought, it usually turns out to be something simpler, which is just strike while the iron's hot. These are opportunistic people who more than likely don't care about how viable it is. They're sort of measuring the way the wind is blowing in terms of the interest of that thing, and it's a novel thing that they can make some quick bucks on because people don't know any better yet.
Right.
And they're going to come in, make the money, and then jet, and they don't really care what the fallout is, which I also find to be crap.
No, I mean, I think that's very similar to what happened with the industrial hemp push. There's a lot of money on the front end of that. And a lot of people who wanted to know things or who didn't know things and thought money was going to be the key and lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And realized like, hey, this is, all right, CBD is great and all, but it's never going to be, like I was always fascinated with the idea that people would open a whole store with the intention of selling nothing but CBD product. Because it just, coming from a retail background, I was like, okay, so what makes you think the interest in this singular product is going to carry an entire store? Like, do you know how many people would have to be walking in every day looking for just something associated with this?
And now, I mean, it's like there's multiple mini malls that
On
have
top of
several stores within them.
And I still look at them and go, how does that work? Because I consider myself somebody really interested.
Yeah.
And I know how much I need to use at any given time is very limited. To maybe I'd visit a store like that if I needed it as a resource every 3 months. Because I see it as a supplement.
Well, yeah, and even going back to the internet as a big factor in all of this, it seems to me like that's the appropriate technology to serve that purpose because you have, I mean, there are things where the internet is the wrong answer for that. But in this case, you have reputation management baked into the internet protocol, and you have competition actually doing what any good capitalist thinks competition is supposed to do for the equation. It's supposed to high grade these things. It doesn't always do that. But so it seems like that's the appropriate tech solution to it. And these little stores,
these brick and mortar stores. I mean, the landlord's got to love it,
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, time will tell.
I think it's short-lived. It's going to be short-lived.
Time will tell. But yeah, that's an example of what you're talking about. One of these things that has some potential great benefit,
And so pulling that back to the aquaponics thing, which we got off on that tangent, you still believe that I certainly still do, but I know that you're more in those trenches and you've done the actual systems. I've been around them, but I haven't done any of them yet. So, and I say yet because I definitely want to work on that with you on that. But you still think it's a viable?
I think it's viable relative to scale. I think you need to. My home aquaponic system, if I focused on that, I could probably grow enough food in there to keep me and my family at least, flush in greens and, herbs and things like that year round.
Nice.
And I say that without any hesitation.
Right.
From what I've seen.
And so there's two things. One is this particular region that we're in, El Paso, Las Cruces, water is clearly an issue.
Absolutely.
And aquaponics is one of those things that holds a lot of promise for addressing that because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that it uses 1/10 of the water that conventional farming uses.
It does.
So that by itself would seem like a no-brainer to actually like get into that and
Correct.
figure out what
Well,
it
the
can
thing
do.
about it is scale,
Mm-hmm.
because it holds 1/10 if you have the right environment.
Okay.
The evaporative rate is pretty high if it's just
Right.
outside.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And it's still less. It's still a lot less water. But the evaporative rate and those fish are needing that water
Right.
too.
Right.
You know
right.
what
Yeah,
I mean?
and temperature.
So
the type of fish are
They're making
geared
heat-
for the
yeah,
temperature, the
absolutely.
water, and all of that. So
Absolutely.
an enclosed space in this environment would be the way to go, more than likely.
More
And
than
then the
likely.
other related issue that was the scale of the operation, which is why I
Exactly.
mentioned the chia goldfish thing.
Right.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the bigger the system,
Mm-hmm.
and the more uh, robust,
Mm-hmm.
and the longer it's been in operation, the more stable a system becomes.
Yes, absolutely.
So, like the cooties that are growing in the water
Exactly.
get
All of that stuff.
optimized.
Exactly. All of that becomes a benefit, as long as you don't kill the fish. I mean, that becomes the biggest. At a certain point, you're like, all right, is it water temperature, water quality?
Mm-hmm.
My biggest challenge with the water has been using municipal water,
Yeah.
where you need to put water in that tank. Whatever the day is, you need to put water in that tank,
Mm-hmm.
or these fish aren't going to make it.
Right.
The water source, depending on what's happening with water treatment, could actually kill those fish.
Right. Right.
You know.
Yeah, and I don't want to
So-
get too far off track with all that, but we've talked about some, again, appropriate technology is kind of the lens that I'm trying to develop with even having this conversation and these conversations.
Yeah.
But things like slow sand filters, things like even solar distilling operations and
Yeah.
things like that, can mitigate some of those contaminants.
Absolutely, and even better planning on my part. You
Right,
know,
having it
have I
on
just
tap.
had water in rain barrels and stored, anticipating I'm going to need to use that.
Right.
I could get that water and just let it sit, and a lot of that would off gas, and I wouldn't have to worry about it so much, you know, and I could manage it a little bit better.
Right.
But it's me having so many things to do. It's just like, you run over here and fill this tank real quick. So I think, you know, what I'd like to do is create a model that is somewhere in between, where people can visualize how they can scale it down and make that a household model that they can make work. Or somebody could go, you know, I could really scale this up and make this a commercial model that would work for me.
And of course, my thing that, again, I've mentioned to you multiple times is there's this sweet spot between those two models that has to do more with like a community scale, you know, cooperative sort of endeavor. I think that scale is kind of one of the under discussed problems of you know, why a lot of these efforts to make things more humane and more efficient and more effective really fail. And that's an underappreciation of the how scale affects these things.
Right.
So to me, the sweet spot is always this thing that I talk about, the village scale, or the, you know, sort of a neighborhood scale of where you've got on the one end of the spectrum the individual family homestead that's inherently precarious.
Right.
There's very little backup. There's very little, you know, cushion. And then on the other end, these huge, completely unaccountable corporate models that at the end of the day don't really care if they're doing the thing that they claim to be doing.
Correct.
They just need to survive financially.
Right.
So, and the systems are designed to encourage that.
Right.
Vets for that. So, so trying to pull it back to this middle thing where you've got some backup and you've got some camaraderie and some you know, community in the true sense, not in the sense of the, you know, green entrepreneurial strike while the iron's hot. Like people care about this right now, so we can exploit that model. We're trying to get away from that, recognize it for what it is, and keep the baby, get rid of the bathwater with that. So, yeah, so the aquaponics thing, I think, is definitely a model of activity that has a lot of those factors inherent in it, and you can point at it if you have the opportunity, like a Will Allen, to say, hey, look, this is not only what we're doing, but it's how we're doing it and why we're doing it.
Right.
and what is something I'm super excited about developing in real time, even for if we end up having an audience and doing this, which I hope we do, having that be documented as we build that up.
Absolutely.